right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Plays Well with Others, our podcast about building and participating in effective teams while actually enjoying it. This is episode 23, and as always, I'm your host, Andrew Moore, joined by my illustrious co host, Jess Agnew. And so today, we wanted to chat about a topic on maybe the other side of the coin from a lot of our topics. A lot of our topics, we've kind of assumed that you're already working on a business strategy, you're already up and running, and we've talked about change management, we've talked about how to build engagement and culture and direction and all that good stuff. But there's a lesser talked about topic around how do I go from zero to, say, the first 60 miles an hour. I have a vision,
Yeah.
I've got a direction, I've drawn all the pictures, I've built the backlog. Now I got to actually do it. And there's a lot of ways you could go about execution. And the best story I've ever heard to visualize the execution model is Walt Disney and his brother. And Jess, you're going to know the brother's name because I don't.
Raw? Wait, I don't know.
I don't either. In any case, everybody knows Walt Disney, but they coined it as the dreamer and the doer. So Walt Disney came up with these big grandiose visions of everything that Disney could be, and his brother actually made it happen. And you see that partnership again and again and again in business. You have a CEO that's got all of the vision, all of the dreams, and then you have a COO or a president or whoever that has to take those dreams and match them to reality. And
boots on the ground, get the stuff done.
And so I texted Jess this morning a question of, how do I know? So once I have a vision, once I have a direction and strategy, all of that good stuff, how do I know when to hire, what roles to hire, and how do I match those up with the business strategy? And that's where it's certainly just one component of execution, because obviously there's work management, which we have talked about in the past. So go back and find that episode. It's one of the other 22. So I apologize for the lack of specificity. You just have to listen to all of them.
Yeah, your hands are tied. You have no choice.
Right. And leave a comment as you go along. Make sure to thumbs up every episode.
To say, this isn't it. This isn't it. Found it.
Right. So tell us when you find the episode that I'm talking about, because we have short-term memory loss here. But so Jess and I both have gone through the process of standing up a department from zero.
Yep.
And I think we both have similar but slightly different approaches to how we build out the functionality of the department. And Jess, I'm curious, that may be a function of the fact that product is slightly different than engineering in terms of
potentially
how you want to attack the backlog or attack the problem, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
On one hand, with product, you can kind of carve off things and start enriching as you go.
For sure. Yeah. Well, I think there's when I look at building a division, there's definitely a lot of consideration for the specific organization that I bring a person into that helps play a huge role in what kind of people I need, when I want to bring them in, how I want to stagger bringing in new hires. If I'm looking at an organization that needs a lot of hand holding, then maybe I'm going to be looking for a really, sophisticated or more advanced person to bring in initially so that they can kind of help me build a framework. So then when we bring in, the people underneath them, it's a little bit easier. And there's a couple different people that can help with training. There's a lot more personality, I think, involved in who I'm bringing in as well than I think you're going to have probably when you're looking at bringing in for engineering. Not that they can't have great personalities and not that that can't help. It just may not be as high on the list of things when you're starting to hire.
I don't know. I don't know about that. It's now, don't get
it's
me
important.
wrong. the main interaction point of engineers is often other engineers, right? And the main touch point with a product person is going to be someone less engineeringly minded,
Everyone.
right? So
But to your
you gotta
point,
find
now that
those
you're saying
different.
this out loud, now that you're saying that out loud, I'm actually rethinking my answer or my point there, because you're right. Like, being able to bring someone in that's going to play well with others is going to be very important. So you do have to actually pay close attention. I suppose that always matters. It doesn't matter the role.
I shy away from absolutes, but I think it matters more often than it doesn't. So, first question I think we should deign to answer is, how do I know when to hire? So, my opinion, it's obviously it's a nuanced situation, as is most things in business, or as are most things in business. But when you're starting out as a one person show, I've got a small business startup that I've pulled from the ground up. I think that answer is fairly straightforward. As soon as you can't do something, you got to hire somebody in to do it, right?
Well, even then, though, even if you can do it all, if you're spending your time on things that are very time consuming, that don't drive as much value, maybe that's a time that you bring in someone as well. So, hey, these administrative things need to get handled, and I just need someone to fill the copier and, do these very administrative things so that I can focus on stuff that's actually going to earn us revenue.
Yeah, fair enough. And it's the way that I think about it, and I've mentioned this in other episodes, is do the thing that only you can do. So, I mean, again, nuanced, but when you're starting bootstrapping yourself or bootstrapping a new organization up, obviously you're not going to be just working 40 hours. You're not punching the clock. So
Mm-hmm.
you're probably going to be doing a lot of making coffee and filling your own copier. But at some point, if the administration takes off, if the job takes off, the organization takes off and starts really making money, then you do want to focus on the things that only you can do and
Yeah.
offset some of that, because your time becomes worth more, and to budget it, really. I do think of the stories that you get on TikTok and you wind up on billionaire talk, which is always entertaining.
I didn't even
But
know that was a thing.
try to answer the question. There's one particular account that I'm trying to think of and I can't remember, but the guy's a former investment banker and is a serial entrepreneur at this point and just a rich guy for a living. But the question is, why do it's the premise is how rich people versus really rich people interact with different situations, and the private jet comes up, right? And I've had this conversation with a bunch of different people. You look at somebody that wants to charter a private jet to go on a trip. The rich guy does it because it's luxury and exclusivity and whatever the facade that we talked about last week, that helps drive the ego. But the really rich guy
Mm-hmm.
does it because his time is worth exponentially more, and he doesn't have time to be sitting for 2 hours in the airport waiting on a public flight like everybody else. He needs to get to Fort Lauderdale in 2 hours and have his meeting and get back home because he's got to be at another thing that afternoon or a function. So
Yeah, that so often happens to me.
it's all the time. I
So
almost never
frequent.
have to drive myself to the airport.
Yeah, definitely not.
For those of us without the video, we are definitely being facetious.
Yeah, if that wasn't clear. So
But
I like the concept of you hire someone when you need to be able to focus on the thing that you do best. I think that's a really good explanation of when to hire someone. I also think there comes kind of a point where the thing that you do really well, you need to have a partner with that. And that might be where you start thinking about bringing in leadership who can help, build out that thing that you do well even more. And it's interesting because when you start building a team from scratch, there comes the question of, do you build from the ground up or do you build from the top down? And I do think that's an interesting concept as well, because if you know you're going to need to build an entire division and you know that's going to come with some organizational hierarchy below yourself, where do you start?
Well, we've had this conversation before when it comes to prioritizing work. How do you know what's the most important versus what's the most urgent?
Mm-hmm.
And the way that I look at it is you've got to start with a problem statement. What is it that I'm trying to accomplish? Because you can't start with I'm building a division or I'm building a department, right? You've got to start with I'm trying
What
to,
problem are we solving for the organization? Why are we
right?
here? What are we trying to do? What are the things that we're going to contribute?
There are finite levers that we can pull in a business, and it's often more cash, more time. Well, actually, that's pretty much it. You can throw more money at it, or you throw more time at it. Money could be additional headcount, additional people, or it could be bringing in consultancies, contractors, whatever. Time, with fewer people, you can still accomplish a lot of the same things. It just takes longer.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to
Yeah.
start with what are you trying to accomplish? Is it I need to pay down technical debt and maintain a platform and ensure that it's stable? Well, in that case, you can probably leverage a little bit more time than money. But
Mm-hmm.
if you're trying to launch a product, you start off with a startup and you've got your cash up here and it's not going up yet, it's going down. So you got to make sure that you've got a product and you're selling that product before your cash gets to zero, because then it's game over, right? So in that case, yeah, you're probably going to spend a lot more upfront to get people in to build and sell the product. So you've got to
Yeah.
start there, right? And I still focus on where you bring in managers, and maybe that's a good next topic. It's like we know you need to start hiring as soon as your time becomes more valuable with what you are good at doing versus wearing many hats. So you're trading off hats for additional people that are good at what they do, they're experts.
Mm-hmm.
Then once you've decided that I need to bring in these type of people, I need to bring in individual contributors, I need to get engineers, I need to get product owners, I need to get salespeople, BDRs, SREs, etc. Once you get those people in, when do you start bringing in managers for those people? Because now you're kind of at the point where rubber's meeting the road, and presumably you've answered the question of when do I hire at each tier of management, because now that person's time is worth more doing what they're best at instead of wearing multiple hats.
So here's a question. How do you figure out what roles you need to fill? And we kind of talked about this a little bit before we started, where we were talking about we'd heard about this role that had kind of been written as a certain thing, but the title was very different than what they had written. I do think there's some, I don't know if it's like a human instinct to think that the thing that we need is unique, but there is kind of this like very human thing to go, oh, well, this is a new thing. This is a new role. This is like our organization is so different. We're going to need to define it differently. And I think that that's potentially possible. But for the most part, I think it's a good idea to kind of use some industry standard terminology and definitions when it comes to hiring, because it really does make your role as a hiring manager, it's going to make it a lot easier for you to fill that role, I think, with the right person. So
Mm-hmm.
just something to think about as you're kind of trying to figure out how to define your roles.
Well, right. And I asked the question this week on my LinkedIn: do titles really matter, or how much do they matter? And it's a bit of a loaded question, because yes, titles matter, obviously. Whether I'm a senior engineer or a junior engineer or a VP or whatever. Yeah, like I want the big title because it shows career progression. I mean, there's likely some ego involved in it, and your mileage may vary. Different people, different strokes for different folks, but titles matter. But if you start drilling in, like you're talking about, Jess, there's I want, as much as possible, for a VP to have similar roles and responsibilities at company A as is company B as is company
Yeah,
C. And that becomes more important, I think, as you drill into the more specific roles outside of the or inside the job families. Like a good example is when you have a senior software engineer at one company that's been doing software development for a year and a half, and they were promoted to senior engineer because they were the most senior engineer. But
that's always
then
tricky.
they try to take a senior engineer role at Facebook or Fang. That's not exactly going to match, right?
No,
And I'm not being disparaging. You may have developers out there that have been really devoted to their craft and have disproportionately high skill sets for the amount of time they've been in the role. And
for sure.
great. So, but I think that's on the outliers of the bell curve. For the most part, we try to set or should strive to set the roles based on where the majority of people live within those roles, so that as I progress, I can understand, okay, I'm ready for the next step. Or if I'm not,
Hmm.
this is what I need to be ready for the next step.
And I think to kind of add on to that a little bit, when you start, looking at smaller companies that are getting larger, or even like the example Andrew used before, you're a one man shop and you're starting to grow, there is going to be this kind of desire to build your organization around the people that you have that have devoted time and energy into these smaller organizations. And you can end up kind of shooting yourself in the foot when it comes to being able to scale rapidly later by customizing roles too much to an individual. Because as much as I love loyalty in an employee, and as much as people a lot of times do want to spend time growing a company and participating in that company, no person is obligated to stay with a company. So if you've built an entire role or an entire division around the skill set of an individual and you've customized things to their specifications, you might find them difficult to replace if they were to leave the company. So by allowing your organization to grow in a way that is using industry best practices in terms of skills or in terms of roles that you're doing, you're setting yourself up to be able to scale. And you're also setting yourself up so you're not beholden to one individual to make your organization run effectively.
That's really interesting on a lot of different fronts. So interestingly enough, I was talking with a an acquaintance of mine whose name I won't divulge, but they brought up that they're working with a particular customer, particular company that has over customized their job titles, and it's to a point
I've
where
seen it too.
like developer isn't even called developer. It almost feels like they're, I'm going to use the word cutesy, but trying to be Google. Where I met a guy, I met a guy waiting in line at the movie theater one time. This has been years ago. Who said that, I don't know how true this is or not. I've never been employed at Google, but he said that they basically got to choose their own job titles, and I
I
think
think you can do that when you're Google. I mean,
probably
like there this is the job role thing, customization, like I'm not gonna lie, I love a good customized job role. Sometimes they're very fun and very specific to a person, and that's great, but that maybe only works if you are an industry leader.
well, I think this guy that I met he gave himself the title Chief Awesomeness Officer, which I don't
how
know that
does
any
that
other
how
I
does
don't know
that
that
play on a
anybody's
resume for a future job though?
I really don't know. And I don't know if anybody else is hiring for a chief awesomeness officer. I might would entertain that offer just to see out of curiosity. What does this
It
entail?
could put you in a little bit of a niche market if
A
you
little
start
bit.
looking for a new role. That's all I'm saying.
But it came down to back to non-fang reality. The this person's company was working to the point where they had like developers referred to as producers or product engineers or whatever. And it's like, well, what do I actually do?
Yeah.
And how can I put that on LinkedIn? Can I put that on my resume and have somebody down the road look at it and say, "Oh yeah, I know what that is."
Hmm.
I don't think you can.
No, not chief awesomeness, whatever.
I
Master
would
of awesome
definitely
at Google.
put that on my resume because I've always told you I like a good title, and
But
I
titles matter, right? I mean,
they
like,
do.
and they certain titles are going to like instill certain feelings in a hiring manager who's looking at that title as well, right? I mean, if you come to the table and your resume has something very obscure as a title and it doesn't mean anything, you're losing out on an initial impact to that person. And I'm not saying you need to name the titles at your company such so that your employees can get better jobs later. That's not my point. But I do think that it serves both your employees and you well to have some sort of a standardization in those titles and some sort of a standard leveling in those titles so that, again, you can scale in the future without being tied into a very niche role that you now need to replace because the person who's been there for 17 years who filled that role has now retired and you don't know who can do what they can do because probably the answer is no one. And when you start digging into it, you're probably going to have to break that role apart into three different roles. And maybe there's not even enough work for three different people, but those are the skill sets you're now hiring for.
Yeah. Well, that's the other side of your initial point that's really interesting is title aside, when you define the role and you start trying to hire into that role, if it's so specialized that you can't find anybody other than the person currently sitting in that seat to do the job, then you're going to have problems with scale. Now,
Mm-hmm.
I will say that the approach that I would typically take to starting from scratch is if you find somebody, hire good people over hiring
Yeah,
specifically for the role first. Because if you do find that Swiss Army knife person that can wear the multiple hats and wear them well and keep the plates spinning, well, there's your future leadership team. There's your opportunity to
absolutely.
find the person that is able to manage multiple different practices, multiple different functions well, and not get all spun up and bent out of shape when things get confusing.
Exactly. Yes.
I'll say kind of the last thought on the titles is I've had specific strategies in the past from companies, and different HR teams have different approaches. And I say this is an HR function because typically HR is who leads a job leveling and role mapping initiative because it is kind of fundamentally human capital management.
Mm-hmm.
But I've had opportunities in the past to define job titles, job level, role levels as something a lot less exciting, like software engineer 1, software engineer 2, software engineer 3, all the way up to software engineer 7, because that gives you an opportunity to do salary banding and
Yeah.
building expectations for each role so that you have progression. But from there, you can kind of add the almost what you'd call the marketing title. Like, what are they going to put on their email signature? Because nobody gets super excited about, hey guys, I'm a software developer too now. I mean, maybe, but I heard the best title I think I've heard in all of my years of software engineering leadership. I have a friend who is a master engineer. I, I've
That's
only heard of the
cool.
one. I've only heard of the one, but we've got master engineer, we've got staff engineer, we've got principal, we have distinguished. All of these titles are kind of nice, and they give a little pizzazz to the progression of your career. So you're not just sitting there with a number. I mean,
It reminds me of like back in the day where, you had an apprentice blacksmith. And then when the blacksmith had produced their master work, they became a master blacksmith and they could open their own shop and then take on apprentices of their own. And I kind of like bringing back that terminology to a certain extent because it does very effectively demonstrate the level of effort and skill and capability that this person brings to the table without having to define it because you're not just a engineer 7, you're a master engineer.
Right. There is still some value, particularly in the unions and the trade still use it with apprentices and journeymen
Sure.
and masters, and there's some value in representing the amount of effort that went into developing the title. You know,
Yeah, and titles like that generally go along with I think of it as construction, but there's a whole industry that, kind of still use that terminology, and, bringing it into a corporate setting, I don't hate that idea because it does kind of give you that much more understanding around the book of work that person would be able to bring to the table.
you know, it's not a bad idea. It's particularly the engineering space or the engineering industry, software is what I'm talking about, has built up these communities around almost like public displays of accomplishment. So you've got like back in my day, it was Project Euler. So projecteuler.com, I think, is the website, but there's a list of problems, and there's hundreds, if not thousands, of problems that are complex engineering problems or complex coding problems. And everybody had their GitHub repo, and they would just put out the solutions. And that was a particular flex, I guess. Like, hey, I made it to problem 121, or did you solve this one? And now we've got examples of leak code. So working on the complex problems and throwing the badges up on GitHub when you accomplish them. There's a lot of ways to show skills. The title is just one way to represent that. I've reached a degree of capability in my career, so I should be reflected. And
Mm-hmm.
to bundle that up into a nice closing thought, because we're coming up on time, you start out with nothing, presumably. At some point you have to scale yourself, scale your team, your organization, whatever. So you bring in more people that can do things better than you, and you can focus on the things that you're good at. And then you continue asking and answering that question at different levels of
Yeah.
leadership, so that you're building out more structure as it's needed, not before it's needed, not after it's needed. And then at some point you reach a level of complexity where you have to define role levels and job titles and career paths and progressions and all of that good stuff that makes a really deep organization work.
Mm-hmm.
And there's episodes on each one of these things, very likely, on how you can do it, because there's more than one way to skin a cat.
There's more than one way to skin a cat. There's also more than one way to build an organization.
Yes, I like mine better.
I like the way that you kind of described that, though, right? Because maybe you don't build roles based on specific people, but you can build organizations based on the people you bring in and how you organically grow that organization, and how you position people can have a lot to do with the individual people that you brought into the organization and making sure that you're using them to their fullest extent. So it kind of allows you that flexibility of adhering to who you have and making the most of them, while not shooting yourself in the foot for later.
Yes, and that's really what we're after at the end of the day, is making the best possible decision we can for now that allows us to make a better decision later.
That doesn't actively hurt you later.
Right. Continue growing and only decide as it's necessary, rather than backing yourself into a corner, painting yourself into a corner at the very beginning.
Exactly.
Well, folks, it's been 30 minutes, or 29 minutes and 15 seconds. This has been episode 23. If you've made it this far, really appreciate it. Definitely appreciate all of you that are continuing to listen and tune in and engage with us. If you found us through Apple Podcasts or Spotify or any of your audio podcast platforms, go ahead, give us a share, give us a like. Our personal socials are out there. You can find them, or you can reach out wherever you happen to find this audio or video. We're over on YouTube on our channel, Plays Well with Others, the eponymous channel name. drop us a line on the videos in the comments, or give us a thumbs up. Definitely subscribe and hit that bell so you don't miss anything. This has been episode 23 of Plays Well with Others, and thanks for listening.